Thanks, Chairman. Andrew Kinsella. Just maybe a comment from the experts would be great. At the last session, there was a great chart which demonstrated the concentration of power within the Dáil, within the executive. Now, I know there are lots of other reasons why that might be. My question really is, does the process by which representatives get to the Dáil, does that have a bearing on the concentration of power within the executive once they get there, or is that purely down to the whip system and other things, or does the electoral system have a bearing on that concentration as well?
Okay, thank you. Francis again, and then Tom. Could we get mics? Yeah.
Thank you very much. I feel listening to it, the plot thickens, it gets more and more complicated. But just in terms of first past the post, I think you said, the expert said last week that first past the post, like in the UK, generally can be seen as less representative and favouring the larger parties. So if you go for a system that's first past the post, you have that problem, shall we say, rather than our current system, which is seen as more representative. And then if you combine it with a list system, it seems to me that the key issues about the list system are the points that you made about, how they are put together. And if you like, the democracy of the democratic way they are not put together. And if you take something like, say, the point Katrina has made about gender balance, wouldn't you have to have, really strict criteria adopted? I think that's the point you're making, Michael, about how you would decide on the list within parties, because it could equally be very hierarchical. And, how would you build in? How would you ensure and have parties elsewhere ensured that you build in issues like, gender balance, like, other criteria? And sometimes I think it's party leaders decide. Very often I think it's a national executive. I suppose you could argue, what is the current system, and if you have to, you could contrast it with that as well and see, what actually happens now in candidate selection. But just to make the point as well that it seems to me no matter what political system that you adopt, the whole question of how politics are viewed in a society is really something that's really a topic for this convention as well. The broader issues that impact on how politics are viewed, the culture in relation to politics, the denigration of politics, how do you build more trust in the political system? I know I'm broadening it out, but freedom of information, whatever the range of issues are. And we haven't really talked about that at all, but that clearly is the context for whatever political system that you use. And I think some of those factors are probably more influential perhaps on how politics are or are not viewed. So I'd welcome the comments of the panel just in relation to that broader point, because I think it's an important one.
That general point came up when we were discussing, the role of women in our second meeting, and the general thing that whatever about the rules, there's a wider cultural context within which you're operating, and if you want to effect change, you have to address it at that level. Tom.
Tom Burke. Michael referred in his talk to the possibility that a candidate in the constituency seat being rejected and being elected then on the list system. Surely legislation could provide that if a candidate had been rejected in a particular election on the constituency side, that he or she could not be elected from the list system, and would there be difficulties with that? Thanks.
Okay. Thank you. And last comment here from Alan. I know, but
Alan Green, thanks, Chair. I just have two questions. One relating to the surplus seats. So the Constitution currently provides for a maximum, well, in broad terms anyway, that TD can be represented by no fewer than 20,000 of the population. Would there be a case, potentially, with surplus seats, that a party may not be allowed that full amount of the surplus due to the Constitution as it stands at the moment? And the second point then, or the second question would be about the closed lists. Where they are currently used, are the orderings of the lists generally made known to the electorate, or are they kept secret? Like, are they printed on the ballot papers, or are they private to the parties until after the election? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. I think that we've a number of very interesting questions. So, Michael, you deal with them first.
Okay. I'll begin at the end. Well, those are fresh in my mind. Are the lists made public? Certainly they are. Yes, all the parties would have to make it known before the election who's on their list. They couldn't just, after the election, say, we've got 20 seats and guess what, here's the 20 new TDs that we never told you about before. Yes, they have to make the lists public. Now, how they're made public, they could be hanging up in the polling station like the substitutes for the EP elections are, or put on the web somewhere, but they're certainly known. The surplus seats, the number of surplus seats would not be anything like as large as to breach the Constitution as things stand. And there are other ways of dealing with surplus seats, but that would be the main way in which it's done in Scotland, for example, is to give the party that won the surplus seats, allow them to keep those seats, and every other party loses some of what would have been its proportionate share. Going back to the other questions, does the electoral system determine the nature of relations between governments and parliaments? I mean, that's a question that many academics have tried to study, and we'd only know in this country if there were a different electoral system, then we would see whether things changed. My guess is that things would not change a great deal. One theory is that if a parliament is elected entirely by, say, a closed list system, then all the MPs would know they're answerable only to the party and they'd behave very loyally. But in fact, if we look around Europe, MPs, TDs behave pretty loyally to the party line anyway, whatever the electoral system. So on the whole, I would say probably the electoral system is at best a very minor factor in determining relations between government and parliament. How would the lists be put together and gender balance? Well, certainly when it came to lists, there could be a requirement for gender balance or any other kind of balance on the list. Who gets elected from the list would be a bit complicated in that it might be that, for example, the top name on a list was already elected from a constituency, so their list seat would be passed on to the next candidate, and anyone else on a list who was elected from a constituency wouldn't be taking up the list seat, it would pass on to the one below them, but there could be some requirement that all parties' list representatives must be an exact gender balance, or must be at least 40% male, 40% female, or whatever. The question about how politics is viewed, how politicians are viewed, and whether that's related to the electoral system, it could be a bit related to, in particular, the closeness of the links between TDs and voters, which is a kind of double-edged sword in that we kind of complain about it. A lot of people complain about it. They spend too much time in the constituencies worrying about flickering road lights or potholes or things like that. They should be thinking about bigger national issues, but if they spent all their time thinking about bigger national issues and weren't aware of what was going on in the constituencies, then we complain that they're a completely out of touch political class, and we really want politicians who are more linked to the constituencies. And in many ways, it's said about America that Americans hate Congress but love their congressman, and it could be a little bit similar in this country, that politicians as a species, so to speak, have a rather bad image, and yet people might think the local man, the local woman is actually active and they're doing good things and they're interested in what's happening here. Well, that's part of the constituency connection, which has its positives and its negatives. And then finally, on the dual candidacies thing, is it right that someone could be rejected in one of the constituencies and yet get in anyway via the lists? Well, that seems in some way undesirable, and yet it's almost unavoidable. Every MMP system, apart from Wales, does allow candidates to stand on both, and it really has to be done that way because it's so erratic how many list seats a party will get. Because if they win a lot of constituency seats, they might not win any list seats. So as I was saying earlier, at the last election, Fine Gael would have won more constituency seats than its total entitlement. So if Enda Kenny had been number one on the list and not in a constituency, he would not have been elected because Fine Gael would not have qualified for any list seats. And to ban dual candidacies would be particularly tough on small parties. The Green Party, for example, even its leader might not be elected from a constituency, although he or she would no doubt stand there. So it would seem very unfair to say to the leader that because you lost in a constituency, you can't get elected from a list either. So in practice, dual candidacies is really an integral part of MMP. MMP is built on the assumption that candidates will stand in both, and as David Farrell said earlier, they might be elected one time from a list, another time from a constituency. They should be seen as part of the same package.
David or Michael, do you want to make any comment? Michael, please.
Just on the, I think this somewhat
Michael,
loaded
microphone.
term of rejected by the electorate. Two things. First, that's what we've got at the moment. That's what the Seanad's for. It's for all those people that couldn't get in some other way. Secondly, in what sense are people rejected? They're rejected because they weren't the most preferred candidate. But just because someone isn't the most preferred doesn't mean they're rejected. If you could have had two people, maybe you would have had the person who was elected and one other. If someone came bottom of the poll and didn't win any votes at all, then you might say they were rejected. But I don't see how you can say they were rejected because they came second or third or even fourth.
Okay, we've come to the end of our time for this session. I'm sorry about that. Just to say, we had attempted to have a practitioner from Scotland to be present for this particular session, to bring that element of direct experience of a different system, and he couldn't at the last minute. I'm afraid he had to pull out. So I think we've got if you like, a good starting outline of the possibilities here. So we're going to break for coffee, and then we're going to resume with, I think, a very interesting debate about the current system, for and against. Thank you very much. 15 minutes for coffee.